We're delighted to have Professor Sarah Ruble back, her third visit, and to talk about Christian nationalism. They've been in the news, and as church people ourselves, we wonder, who are these people, and what are they after? And we tend to paint them with a broad brush and think they're all alike. And I think we need to know more about who they are and the agenda, if there is one. So, Professor Ruble just seems to have a knack for explaining things. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Oops. Sorry about that. Whoa. I'm causing more problems here. All right, just because I tend to move around a lot.
Sarah,
Yeah.
you may be able to speak loud enough for this
Maybe
room.
just, can I just do it like this?
Sound like gunshots.
Okay, we'll do that.
Can you pick her up okay?
Okay. All right, we'll give it, I will use my teacher voice. And that's me. I will, again, try not to annoy you by how much I walk around. So yeah, today we're going to talk about Christian nationalism and both sort of it's how it looks today, but also to place it into some historical context, because I think understanding the historical context here is important, both just because it gives us a sense of what it is and where it comes from, but also why it has so much power, or why it's such a powerful idea to people. So I'm going to start with this as a tweet by a guy named Ryan Burge, who does a lot on religious statistics, those sorts of things. And you have the PowerPoint in front of you. This is mainly just so I know where I am, so if you can't see it, you can just look at the same thing in front of you. So this is from 2022, right? But he says, feel like Christian nationalism is all over your Twitter feed right now? It's because it is. In April of 2022, there were 39,000 tweets with this phrase. In July of 2022, so just a few months later, there were 289,000 tweets with Christian nationalism. There were around 200,000 tweets with Christian nationalism in all of 2021, right? So from the perspective of people who are just kind of minding their own business, right? This is not a phrase you talk about, it's not something you think about it. All of a sudden in 2022, this phrase starts coming into the national consciousness in a new way, which can lead us to this idea that it's this new thing, right? Something new has emerged on the stage, and we've got to like figure out what it is. We don't know where it came from. And so what I'm going to do today is say it's not new in any, like at all. The packaging is a little bit different. How it's appearing might be a little bit different, but the underlying concepts are very, very old. The other thing, again, a bunch of numbers here. Don't have to get them all. But one of the, so this is from a Pew Center piece last, let's see, this is also 2022. Asking a question about, is America supposed to be a Christian nation? Okay? Which is often one of the ways that people talk about Christian nationalism. So one of the ways that sometimes people describe Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalists think that America should be a Christian nation. Okay? I'm going to argue that that's a not great definition, because it ends up including a lot of people who, if we include them as Christian nationalists, we don't really know what we're talking about anymore, right? I mean, if you say that America should be a more Christian nation as a basic definition, you get Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King Jr. as Christian nationalists, which is not a helpful understanding of whatever it is we're talking about. I mean, that might be something else, but it's not them, right? Because what they would mean by that would not be whatever we're talking about as Christian nationalists mean. So to highlight that, whoops, uh-oh, I just hit something.
Press the button again.
There, oh, there we go, yay. All right, if we look at this chart, you'll see that to the question, the founders of America originally intended for the U.S. to be a, quote, Christian nation. White evangelicals are the highest percent. They're 81% agree with that. But actually, black Protestants say 57% of that have that understanding of the beginning. If you go to the U.S. should be a Christian nation, again, 65% of black Protestants say the United States should be a Christian nation. That's lower than the number of white evangelicals. Again, 81% of them say it. But given like how white evangelicals vote and how black Protestants vote, you have to think that they mean something different by Christian nation there. So if we're going to get a definition of Christian nationalism that does us any good in defining a phenomenon, we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper than it should be a Christian nation or it was intended to be a Christian nation. That's just not going to get us very far. Okay. So what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about Christian nationalism? Well, I'm going to give you two definitions that I think are helpful, that actually move us in a direction of saying something meaningful. The first comes from Kristen Dumais. This was from a piece that was in Axios. Kristen Dumais wrote a book I'll have a picture of later called Jesus and John Wayne, which if you're looking for a good kind of introduction to modern white evangelical politics, it's a great book. But she says that Christian nationalism means essentially the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and needs to be defended as such. Christian nationalism essentially reflects the idea that there is a special privilege for Christians, a certain type of Christian, which is really important here in particular, and that their rights are going to preempt the rights of others. Okay? So when we start talking about Christian nationalism, I think the germ here, the piece of her definition is important, is that it's both that there are Christians who should have special privileges in America, but it's also going to be a certain type of Christian. It's not all Christians. With all due respect to all of you, it's not you. Right? It's not the main line, by and large. Right? It's certain types of Christians, largely conservative, largely white, who are seen as the people who founded the country and the people who should therefore have special privileges in the country. Another definition that explicitly includes race in its definition, and this is, I think, a piece of Christian nationalism we'll talk more about. There are people who suggest that really the word Christian, the term Christian nationalism gets us nowhere, that just racism doesn't. Right? So there are some people who say this whole discussion about Christian nationalism is simply another way of talking about racism, and we should stop pretending otherwise. There are other people who say, no, Christian nationalism, there's something going on there that is embedded, there's racism embedded in it. It's not only that, it's more than that, or less than that, however you want to think about it. But Gorski and Perry, who wrote a book called The Flag and the Cross, what they do with this is they say, like, Christian nationalism is essentially about race, right? So they just call it white Christian nationalism, which doesn't mean that there aren't black people who are part of this movement, but it does mean that ideas about who is in charge of the country and that those are racialized ideas are for them an integral part of Christian nationalism. So they say white Christian nationalism's deep story goes something like this. And let me explain what a deep story is. So they're speaking here as sociologists. And what they're saying is people have in their minds when they think about themselves or their families or their country, what they call a deep story, this way of understanding the world that is so deeply ingrained, it's often not explicit, right? You have to really almost sometimes work with people to get out their deep story because it's so much in their bones, they don't always say it. So the deep story is the way they frame when they're thinking about themselves. I know I'm switching metaphor here from bones to frames, but just work with me, right? These are ideas that frame their whole way of seeing the world, right? And so when you're talking about someone's deep story, it gives their whole outlook on life meaning, which makes it really hard to move, and also a really deeply felt part of themselves. Okay, so what is the deep story of white Christian nationalism? America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were, quote unquote, traditional Christians who based the nation's founding document on Christian principles. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it has been so successful, and the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences both inside and outside our borders. Okay? So this is the deep story. This nation was founded by Christians. So these are people who are going to have big fights. If you say, Thomas Jefferson wasn't really a Christian, they're like, oh no, but he really was. Right? George Washington was very devout. Like, they were very invested in this very strong narrative of Christian foundings, right? So people who say, like, the founding fathers had, like, they went to the Bible to understand how the world should be. They were influenced by the Bible and not the Enlightenment. They were influenced by their idea of Jesus and not French philosophers in founding the country. Okay? And that is the core of what America is. And anything that threatens it is threatening what has made America good and great.
Sarah,
Yeah.
does anybody actually know what the founding fathers' Christian identity was? So were they maybe more leaning towards Protestants that are not, they were obviously weren't Catholics,
Right.
but Protestants that were not conservative?
Right, so I mean, the thing about the founding fathers is there was many of them, and they differed. So you have, among the founding fathers, there were some who we would think of as like little o-orthodox Trinitarian Christians, right? And then there are people like Jefferson, who I would say, so there's a historian who once said of Abraham Lincoln that he was Protestant, not Christian. Which is maybe what I would say of Thomas Jefferson as well, is Protestant, not Christian.
But they believe in God, right?
Believed in God, like, so people who are like, so kind of what we call deists, right? So all of which is to say there's a spectrum, right? The thing about the founding fathers is if you want to prove something about them, you probably can because one of them probably said it, right? But they weren't a monolith. All right. So 3 key features, again, working from Gorski and Perry about Christian nationalism. They'll say that if you want to boil down how this works in practice, they believe in freedom for us, whoever us is, right, speaking for them, themselves and their people, order for those other people. So we need freedom, they need to be ordered and disciplined, right, and we can use violence to achieve all of this if necessary. Okay, so freedom, order, and violence. Okay? All right. So keeping those modern definitions in mind, I now want to go back a little bit and talk about where this comes from. And again, as we do this, sort of think about the deep story here. Okay? And the 2022, oh my gosh, this is appearing all over Twitter, it might be new, right? With what I'm now going to say about like how much a part of the American story a lot of these beliefs are. Not for everybody, but like how deep they go. All right. So there are some people who would say, right, I didn't know about Christian nationalism until January 6th. There would be some who would trace it back to this guy, who you probably don't recognize, but is a Puritan named Cotton Mather, who I'll talk about in a sec. And then there are people who would trace it not to the windows, but actually to the European discovery of America. Okay? So I'm actually going to go back here to the European discovery of America. Oh, I don't want to use this thing. Yeah. There we go. Okay, and talk a little bit about some of the roots here. So now, what's important here, for those of you who are like, but Americans didn't discover America. You're right. So part of the message here is that Christian nationalism isn't specific to the United States. So you can find in British history, British versions of this, right? Or in Spanish history, Spanish, I mean, there's ways of having these kind of nationalisms in other contexts. This isn't specifically American. I know we like to think of ourselves as special, but a lot of times we're just a lot like everybody else. Sometimes we're different, but sometimes we're a lot like everybody else. So, going back to what's called the doctrine of discovery. So as the Spanish and Portuguese in the 15th century, so the 1450s, 1460s, were beginning to go, come to what to them was the New World, to the people living here was not. There was this need, according to Europeans, to decide what to do, right? Whose land was it? And to settle that particular question, the Pope decided to give an answer about whose land it was and what they could do with the land and the people on it. And here's what one Pope said in 1452, this becomes known as the Doctrine of Discovery. The Portuguese king, according to the Pope, is allowed to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens or Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wherever so placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? So in other words, if you're a Christian, and at this point, right, this is pre-Reformation, so you're a Christian, and you go out and you discover something, and those people aren't Christians, you get their stuff. And not just their stuff, but them. And the thing that does that is that you're a Christian and they are not. Right? So the Doctrine of Discovery says Christians, by virtue of being Christians, get to have other people's stuff.
Well,
Okay?
I'm not sure.
All right. So think about that kind of, that way of thinking about the world, right? That other people, like you as a Christian, have what you might call a divine right to anything that you come into. And that right is because you are God's chosen. All right. So this idea is in the heads of Europeans when they come and begin to colonize what becomes the United States of America. And I want to talk about two pieces of it that happen in, well, the 17th and the 18th centuries in two different places in New England and in Virginia. So here with where I'm going to get, so if this is a little bit confusing, just bear with me, right, is both this really strong sense of a Christian right to the land and an understanding of Christianity as being defined by white people. So both of those things coming together. And this is one of those moments where, as historians, we like to talk about contingency. Contingency is just our big fancy word for meaning it could have been otherwise. None of this is written in the stars. There were things that happened that people did that made it this way. It could have been otherwise. Okay? So we're looking at some of how this came to be as it did. All right. So I'm going to start up here in the top in Virginia. And one of the things that happens over the course of the 17th century, so the 1600s and into the 18th century in Virginia, was what we talk about now as the construction of race, which might seem like a strange term, but just bear with me. It means the idea that there are categories of people defined by their skin color, and that those categories have social meaning. Okay? Now, I know this is, sometimes people give me funny looks when I start talking about this. None of you are, but you're also Minnesotans, so you wouldn't. This is one of those moments where people are like, yeah, but people have different skin color. Yes, we know this, right? They also have different heights. And we don't give social meaning to height. I mean, largely speaking, right? Or there are people with freckles and people without freckles. And outside of the 3rd grade, that has no social meaning. There are all sorts of physical characteristics that people have, where we can say, you look different than you, but we don't give them social meaning. The construction of race is a moment where we gave social meaning, by we I mean humans, to skin color, and that's a choice. It could have been otherwise. So in Virginia, over the course of the 17th century, for example, it was not clear at the beginning that having black skin would mean that you are understood to be naturally a slave, and that having white skin would mean that you're understood to not be able to be a slave. That came into being through law. They had to pass laws to make that happen, because it's not just clear that that's how it would be. And if this was a different lecture, I'd go into all the laws, but I'm just going to ask you to believe me on this one. But part of what they did as they did that was they also began to differentiate kind of real Christians from kind of Christians. A couple of ways. And what I mean by that is that people who got the full benefit of Christianity were white people. Full benefits of Christianity included things like not being enslaved. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, how's that a full benefit of Christianity? I mean, there have been Christian slaves, we know that, I mean, it's in the New Testament. True, but by the time we get to the 17th century, the people who are colonizing Virginia are English Protestants. And one of the things that English Protestants think that Protestantism does as opposed to Catholicism is that it's about freedom, right? They're very big on this. Like they see Catholicism, which they don't understand to be Christian, right, as being about enslavement to the papacy, right, that evil thing. And Protestantism as being about freedom. But freedom for some people more than others. True freedom for white Protestant Christians. If you're a black person who converts to Protestant Christianity, you can convert, but it doesn't give you full freedom. They pass a law that says that, right? Baptism does not free you from slavery. It's interesting they have to pass a law to say that, because actually it was possible that it might, right? There were a lot of slaves who thought, oh, this should free me from slavery. And there were actually slaveholders that didn't want their slaves to convert because they were afraid that conversion might mean that they were no longer slaves. So they passed a law saying, actually, full freedom for white people. You can be black, and a Christian, but you're a black Christian. If you're white, you're just a Christian. Do you see the difference there? So there are laws we could go into when they do this. They'll use the word Christian, and then they'll talk about Christians who are black. Black Christians. Because clearly, the people who are Christian without remainder are white people, and the people who have a remainder are black people. Right? So we're beginning to define who's really Christian on a racial basis. So being white is the full ideal of being Christian. You can be black and be Christian. But you're a black Christian, not just a Christian. Something similar is happening in Puritan New England with the guy with the great wig, Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is probably best known for being part of the Salem witch trials, but he also wrote a famous history of New England. And in that history, he very much depicts the Puritans as God's chosen people. This is somewhat familiar language to us, right? Who are essentially the new Israel, who have come to the promised land And there are other people in that promised land. And those other people need to be exterminated if they will not be subdued, because they are the Canaanites, and they are not the people to whom God has given the land. So again, there's this move to make white Protestants God's people who get the land, who should control the land. There might be other people in the land, but those people have two choices. They can get in line, or they can be gone. That's, for someone like Cotton Mather, what God has intended. All right. Moving then to the 19th century, we're going to see the same. If you're like, is this just going to be the same story repeated? Yeah, it is, several times. And the point here is the deep story, how deeply embedded this is in the American psyche. All right, this is a piece from the 19th century from a guy named Lyman Beecher. If you know the last name Beecher, you know about like 75% of 19th century American religious history. Lyman Beecher was one of the most famous American Protestants of the first part of the century. His son was one of the most famous preachers of the last part, and his daughter was a little woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you have possibly heard of, right? So this is a pretty big, these are not just random people. These are people who have significant social and religious authority in American culture. And in the 1830s, Lyman Beecher wrote a famous piece. He actually gave a speech called A Plea for the West. And A Plea for the West was about the need to send Protestant missionaries to that well-known western outpost of Ohio. But again, in the 1830s, that is the West. I'm from Washington State, so like this is just amusing to me. But his concern at that point was that the people going to the West were two groups. People who were Protestants who were going to stop going to church, and more problematically, Catholics, who were beginning to come in more significant numbers, and who weren't, according to Lyman Beecher, the right kind of people. And so what Lyman Beecher argued is that Protestants needed to go to Ohio and start schools and start churches because they needed to make sure that the children of those Catholic immigrants became Protestant. And that the Protestants going out there didn't become Catholic. Okay? That's his speech. And why he thinks that, again, is important and goes to this deep story. So to the question, right, which would be a reasonable question, like, why do Protestants need to be in charge? Like, why is it important that a country is a Protestant country? Lyman Beecher has this answer. It was the opinion of Edwards, so now he's invoking the authority of Jonathan Edwards, a famous 18th century theologian, that the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of peace and justice that would, in Lyman Beecher's understanding, precede the coming of Christ, would commence in America. When I first encountered this opinion, I thought it chimerical, okay, made up. But all the providential developments since and all the existing signs of the times lend corroboration to it. It is equally plain that the religious and political destiny of our nation is to be decided in the West. There is the territory, and there soon will be the population, the wealth, and the political power. The Atlantic commerce and manufactures may confer always some peculiar advantage on the East, but the West is destined to be the great central power of the nation, and under heaven must affect powerfully the cause of free institutions and the liberty of the world. There is no danger that our architecture and arts will not prosper. The danger is that our intelligence and virtue will falter and fall back into dark-minded, vicious populace, a poor, uneducated, reckless mass of infuriated animalism, to rush on resistless as the tornado, or to burn as if set on fire of hell. Those other people could stop the United States, according to Lyman Beecher, from being what it's called to be. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen. Protestants need to be in charge. And we can see in Lyman Beecher what's kind of going to be a through theme here, which is he's got to say two things at once. One of which is only Protestants can ensure religious liberty. We're the only ones who really get it, according to Lyman Beecher. Also, it's really important that everyone be Protestant so we can ensure religious liberty. So he's got to kind of let Catholics be Catholics because that's what religious liberty means. But he thinks it's really important that Protestants be in charge because they're the only ones who really believe in religious liberty. Okay, it's this thing he's got to kind of work himself out of. All right, and then one more from the 19th century. This is late 19th century, a theologian named Josiah Strong, writing again about the role of now, he's going to be very explicit, Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the world. And part of the reason I bring up Josiah Strong is because Josiah Strong in the late 19th century is not a theological conservative. A lot of times when we talk about Christian nationalism, we assume that this is the domain of theological conservatives. It's not. It's quite possible to be a theological liberal in the 19th century and be a Christian nationalist, what we would today call a Christian nationalist. Those things can go together. So there's no obvious relationship between conservative theology or liberal theology and Christian nationalism. Either can get you there if that's where you want to get. So this is Josiah Strong, again, talking about why massive immigration is bad for the country. It's not necessary to argue to those for whom I write the two great needs of mankind, that all men may be lifted up into the light of the highest Christian civilization are first, a pure spiritual Christianity, and second, civil liberty. Without controversy, these are the forces which in the past have contributed most to the elevation of the human race, and they must continue to be in the future the most efficient ministers of its progress. It follows then that the Anglo-Saxon, as the great representative of these two ideas, the depository of these two greatest blessings, sustains peculiar relations to the world's future, is divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. Again, there is a special role, and he's not being coy about this, not now just for white Protestants, but Anglo-Saxon Protestants, in ensuring God's blessings on the world. Which then Strong and other places will go on to be clear it means that eventually everybody else will kind of be taken over by Anglo-Saxons and eventually probably die out. All right. So we see then all of this is to say this deep understanding in American history that there are people who need to be in charge if America is to be what it was created to be. And those people are white and those people are Protestant. In the 1950s, we get some things happening that, again, work in the same way. One is we begin to see white Catholics getting a little bit more ability to insert themselves into this story. So throughout much of this time, right, the operative term here had been Protestant in the American context. There are certainly, as we saw from the Portuguese Doctrine of Discovery, Catholic versions of this. But in the United States, right, Catholics were held under a great deal of suspicion. In the 1950s, after World War II, we begin to see that there are ways now that Catholics can begin to be put under what some people call the sacred canopy and begin to be seen as patriotic Americans in the same way that Protestants are. We also see in the 1950s this concerted effort to tie the U.S. democracy, free enterprise, and religion together. So in the 1950s, we have things like "In God We Trust" put on our money, and "Under God" put into the Pledge of Allegiance. Again, these signs that there is a story about America, and it's a story that we are a godly people in the 1950s as opposed to those godless communists. And our success, to a lot of people in the 1950s, against the godless communists is tied to our godliness. That we are the people who believe in God. All right. So, with all of that as background, I'm going to kind of jump to a little bit more about today. through all of this, there has been what was clear, I think, in the Doctrine of Discovery and Cotton Mather, and less clear in someone like Beecher or in Strong, but still there, a very clear undercurrent of potential violence. The sense that to achieve this godly vision, you might have to use violence against those people who are not getting in line. And for I think a lot of people today, people who are do not understand themselves to be Christian nationalists, for a lot of people today who are confused by particularly white evangelicals' affinity for Donald Trump, there is this kind of question, like, how can they follow someone who seems to be so against so much of what they believe in? Right? There seems to be this really deep contradiction. And what historians are arguing more and more is that it's not. It's not to the people who hold it. And it's not actually a contradiction if you look at the long history. Or maybe a different way of putting it is people are full of contradictions. That happens all the time, right? People can live with all sorts of contradictions. And this is one to the people who hold it makes sense. So I'm working now off of these two books, Jesus and John Wayne, and then The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism. Both two very great historians, both very readable books I commend to you if you're interested in this topic. But again, what they both argue in different ways, using different collections of evidence, is essentially this. White Christian nationalism, in its sense that the nation must be godly, has a deep story that allows for violence, if used by the right people. And you can go back to someone like Cotton Mather and see the logic here, right? The Israelites were commanded to use violence in the Hebrew Bible. They were commanded by God, people would say. And so there are clearly, people who hold these beliefs would say, clearly times when you're allowed to use violence in the pursuit of godly ends. And sometimes the people who are willing to use that violence are not the most respectable part of your movement. Sometimes the people who are willing to get their hands dirty are, well, the kind of people who are willing to get their hands dirty. And they have to do icky things. But that's sometimes what it takes. So this book, Jesus and John Wayne, for example, Kristen Dumais points out that in the 50s and 60s, a lot of conservative Christians really liked John Wayne. They liked his movies, but they just liked him. They liked his persona, they liked his toughness, they liked the whole thing. John Wayne was not a good Christian man, though, by their own accounts. He wasn't, in a lifetime monogamous marriage. He drank, he smoked. I mean, he wasn't Billy Graham. And that can seem like a contradiction, except there's long been this room for people who understand the need for a godly nation, as they would say it, to have people who are willing to do the dirty work. And John Wayne and his characters were willing to do the dirty work. We need that sometimes. The other thing to note about that, though, is that it's highly gendered. And this is another part of Christian nationalism that's really important. So I'm going to go back to the 19th century here. This is a famous, well, maybe famous, strong. This was a picture from a magazine called Lady Godey's Book. It was basically the Good Housekeeping of its day. And I think somewhere the title got cut off, but it's the title of it is like a picture of true womanhood. Okay? So what you'll notice here is this mother, and surrounded by her children, in a very kind of well-kept, peaceful household. This is a picture of stability and normalcy. I left my house today looking nothing like this. I never leave my house. The only time my house begins to approach this is if my mother is coming over. Okay? And that used to be more true until she moved to Minnesota. It used to be she'd come from Washington State and I'd like keep it clean for a week so she didn't think I lived in squalor. Now that she lives here, I've given up the facade. But this picture goes to, again, a long-standing belief among a lot of white Protestants about the roles of gender and the role of home and the upkeep not only of the family but of the nation. And again, a deep story that goes something like this. In a democracy with capitalism, there are people who have to go out into the world and do sometimes morally ambiguous or even morally bad things, right? The realms of politics and the realms of business are at best morally neutral and at worst morally bad areas. Okay? The problem for a democracy is that a democracy depends on having virtuous citizens who will make virtuous decisions. So you have realms that we've just sort of said are going to be morally ambiguous. We have a political system that depends on people making morally virtuous decisions. How are you going to do that? Well, in the late 18th centuries and 19th centuries, and into the 20th century, and for some people into the 21st century, the answer to that is gender roles. Okay. What you're going to do is you're going to have men who have to go out into the world and do sometimes morally troublesome things. But then you'll have women who create these morally pure, relaxing, peaceful environments into which the men can come back and kind of be remoralized, right? And then go back out into the world. Now, is it a complete remoralization? Well, no, because they're going to go back out into the world. But it keeps it from all falling apart. It's enough morality. This is the realm of virtue. This is where people are going to be virtuous enough to keep things running. But it depends on a virtuous woman and a virtuous home, right? And people who are inculcating the right beliefs and all of those things. Alexis de Tocqueville, a famous French traveler who wrote a book called Democracy in America in the 1830s, talked about this very explicitly. That in America, the belief was that the home is kind of the central political unit because it is that place where people are taught virtue and morality that then kind of keeps the nation afloat. But this relies on pretty different gender norms. So for a lot of Christian nationalists, there is at least, even if it isn't always acted out, this sense that men and women have different roles in society, and that particularly men can sometimes do things that are problematic that women would not be allowed to do, but it kind of works out. Because the men do the things that, keep the economy running, make the morally icky compromises, and the women keep it from all just descending into chaos. This is also a very raced vision, right? So when this was published and for that matter, a very classist vision. When this was published in the 19th century equivalent of Ladies' Home Journal, there are a lot of white people and then the vast majority of black people who live nothing like this. They can't achieve these standards. They don't have the money. I mean, this house takes some money. Particularly in the 19th century. there are servants in the background making some of this happen. Right? She's not keeping all this clean herself. Right? This is probably in the north, so there's probably not slaves, I would imagine, in the 19th century. I'm not completely sure about that. But there are probably these servants happening here. Again, there is this sense that it's not just Christians, but there's a certain kind of Christian, a moneyed kind of Christian. A moneyed kind of Christian that's usually historically been a white Christian, but certainly a middle or upper middle class Christian. Those are the people who can do this kind of thing that can really keep us from being okay. Particular type of Christian. It's not all Christians. It's a particular type of Christian. Okay, so some notes and then I'll take a few questions. So when we think today about Christian nationalism, we're thinking again about this movement that has a strong sense that the nation should be Christian by their definitions. Again, what that means for some people is freedom, for other people order and the undercurrent of violence. What for people on the outside then can seem like contradictions are actually part of the belief system. I think for a lot of times there's this sense that if you could just, for people who disagree with Christian nationalism, there's a sense that, well, if I could just sit a Christian nationalist down and explain the contradiction, like they'd get it. The contradiction's part of the deep story. It's not going to be surprising to them. Another thing I think it's important to know is that the Christian, in Christian nationalism, names a number of beliefs that other Christians wouldn't understand as Christian beliefs. This is, again, one of the difficulties of this term, right? So there are some people, when they hear Christian nationalism, they'll think, I don't understand why you think that these beliefs are Christian. Right? What do they have to do with Jesus or the Council of Nicaea or whatever your definition of Christian is? But for Christian nationalism, the term Christian also includes beliefs about gender, about race, about the country, that for them have the same kind of status in terms of authority or the hierarchy of beliefs as things like Christology. So this is for how some people, Donald Trump, who I am absolutely certain could not give me a Christology if he had to, right? How for some people he's a good Christian because he espouses some of the other beliefs, right? He says the right things about, or enacts the right things about gender, about violence, about the country, even though, if you ask him about the Trinity, I don't know what he'd say. I mean, it'd be a word salad, but I don't know what word salad it would be.
He'd be in all three parts.
Well, I mean, that would be the other thing, right? Is that it actually wouldn't be a trinity, there'd be a fourth member. And then again, I think to note that it's not new, okay? So in terms of our consciousness of it, it's new, but it's not new. And there's a couple different ways to look at that not newness, right? And I'm not exactly, I'm going to throw two at you, and they might both have some truth. One of which is that it seems new only because there are now a fair number of people in the country who disagree with the deep story, so that what for a long time had been consensus now has opposition, and so it appears in a way where it was just the water for a long time. I'm not saying that well, right? But to put it another way, for a long time, Christian nationalism was the water in the country. And now, all of a sudden, there are a lot of people who are like, I'm noticing this water. This is weird. And it's not just Tim Walz saying that. Like this is happening in the 50s. Like the civil rights movement saying, like, not good, right? Various liberationist movements saying, yeah, this is not good. And so it appears to us now only because it's being pointed out. Not because it's new, but because people are pointing to it. The other possibility, and I think both of these things can be true, is that there are people who 20 years ago would not have embraced these beliefs in quite the strong way they are now, but for all sorts of reasons are finding them politically convenient. So so that there's a way in which the embrace of these beliefs is increasing, or at least becoming more clear because of a host of other kind of political things. I think both of those things can be true. But I would say overall, it's not new. We're just noticing it in new ways. And then for me, there are some questions that arise out of all this. One is how or can we name the differences between people believing that their values are good and wanting to legislate according to and undermining the democratic process? That question is poorly put, but part of what I mean there is that to go back to what I first said about Christian nationalism, is there are people who want to define Christian nationalism as Christians wanting the country to be Christian. I mean, again, okay, but kind of like Martin Luther King talked about, like wanting the country to like follow the teachings of Jesus more, right? I mean, like that doesn't get us very far. So most people vote out of their deep beliefs. If you happen to be a Christian, you're possibly voting out of those. If you're Jewish, you're possibly voting out of those. If you're Muslim, you're voting out of those. What's the difference between that, which most people do, they vote out of their beliefs, they don't go into the voting booth and say, I have a moral obligation as a person of faith to vote in the opposite way to my beliefs, right? Because I don't want to impose them on other people. That's not what we do. We all vote out of our beliefs. But I think there's a difference between that and this kind of Christian nationalism thing, but articulating that is hard. Right? A lot of Christian nationalists would say, I'm just doing what you're doing. You have deeply held beliefs, I have deeply held beliefs, we're voting on our beliefs. What's the difference? There are differences, but they can be hard to name. And then I think the other question is, what are alternative deep stories? The Christian nationalists have a deep story, and people like stories. People live their lives in stories. Taking away someone's story and not giving them another one is not going to work. So what's the compelling alternative deep story? Because if we don't have one, I think we're going to be left with this one. And I think one of the things that has happened somewhat in the academy in the last 30 or 40 years is that we've been really, really good at deconstructing people's deep stories, and then we leave them in shambles. We deconstruct them, we leave them in rubble, and then we're surprised why they rebuild something we don't like. If you're gonna deconstruct someone's world, you gotta give them something else. Something better, hopefully, but something else. Rather than just saying, well, I've deconstructed and now we're moving on. Because they will reconstruct it, and I think it will probably be that. All right, that is all I had, yeah.
It was wonderful, just great information and thoughtful things you can think about. So question,
Yeah.
so I noticed that you didn't talk about Martin Luther.
Yeah.
And where does he fit into this freedom? And what kind of freedom is he thinking of in related to a Christian national?
Yes, that's a great question. So, I mean, there's probably two answers to this, and I'm very, very scared to give this answer to Mark Trenberg's wife, so just, go home.
Believe me, I won't be able to repeat what you said.
So I think there are a couple answers to that. I mean, the one historical answer is that Martin Luther was part of the magisterial Reformation, which assumed he and Calvin and the people in England, I mean, everyone basically but the Mennonites in the 16th century assumed that the religion of the prince needed to be the religion of the people. That religious uniformity was important for social stability. That was just a working assumption of the 16th century. And that so there was that piece of it. Luther, though, did also have his moments of being able to say that there are civic values that people who aren't Christians have. So Luther said, if I'm remembering correctly, I think he's the one who said something like, I'd rather be led by a competent Muslim than an incompetent Christian, right? It wasn't those words, but something to that effect. So there's that piece. I think But the bigger piece, though, I would say for Luther, and I think this is largely true of the Christian tradition. So Luther's Augustinian. He was an Augustinian monk. He left the Catholic Church. He never left Augustine. And in that definition of freedom, freedom is the freedom to become like God. Freedom is the freedom from sin, right? Freedom is the freedom from fear of death. Freedom is then always for the good of the neighbor, because it can be, because you can go, you don't have to justify yourself for Luther. You can go and live for the good of others. That is a different freedom from the John Wayne, I want to take the West kind of freedom. Freedom in American sense, and in a Christian national sense, for us, whoever us is, has tended to be the freedom to do what I want. For you all, it's the freedom to get in line, right? You've got to get in line, but I get to do what I want, right? So I think for Luther, there is both a political philosophy that we would say, for the most part, again, that's true in the 16th century. There are these moments of insight, particularly with his two kingdoms theology, which I think point in some other directions even for him. But then I think there's just a definition of freedom that is substantively different than this definition of freedom.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
I consider myself to be a Christian, but I'm also a progressive. In their eyes, I don't qualify as a Christian, or?
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right, where Christianity really does get defined as being about a number of things that probably for you aren't any part of Christianity, but do have kind of these political overtones. And then sometimes what you'll see is these kind of litmus tests, right? So where are you on LGBTQ issues? Well, if you're to the left, you're not a Christian, right? Where are you on abortion? Well, if you're to the left, you're not a Christian. So it also then is this kind of slicing away of anybody who's seen as the wrong kind of Christian, right? It's part of the reason, like, where to go back to for example, I would say Hillary Clinton has a very profound Methodist background, and if you kind of trace her political beliefs back, you can get back to a lot of late 19th century, early 20th century Methodist understanding of the social good and the social order. It's deeply religious, and many people in this camp would say that she has not a religious bone in her body, because they don't recognize it as religious.
Yeah, and in Jimmy Carter.
Right, yeah,
Oh my gosh.
same thing, right?
One of the seminal moments in this whole discussion is when Hillary came out with the term deplorables.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, she's going to stir up a hornet's nest with
Right.
that kind of language.
Yeah.
But I think she saw the writing on the wall.
Right, yeah, and I think, it's, part of what is difficult, I was in that moment too, she was, I think people thought she was saying all Republicans, and she wasn't. There was a whole bunch of things going on there. But I think also understanding that there are a lot of people who talk the talk of Christian nationalism because it gets them what they want.
Yeah.
Right? On some really basic level, I think there are a lot of people, I'll use Donald Trump as an example because I believe this pretty firmly. Like, again, I don't think he has a theological bone in his body, even when I think he was more cognitively engaged than he currently is. But this language gets him what he wants economically. It plays very nicely with a certain form of capitalism because it's going back to freedom. It's kind of the freedom that I get to do what I want, right? So it covers, with this language of piety, I think for a lot of people, an economic vision in today's understanding of Christian nationalism that serves people who have no other investment in this view, right? They're happy to regulate other people's sex lives. They're not going to let their own sex. Right? It's also a very two-tiered system, right? Donald Trump will be happy to make laws for other people that he will have no interest in living up under. Now, I think there are people who are like for real Christian nationalists who really actually believe that people should live in certain ways, and they want to legislate. I would say Mike Johnson is probably like authentically believes in the moral stuff. He really thinks people should live in certain ways, and that if we have to legislate that, that would be good for people. And he'd probably be willing to live under most of it. That's different than I think what some other, like Matt gets is Christian nationalism.
I have one more
Yeah.
question. Tell me what your thoughts are about the Latin population that is swinging more and more conservative and right now. For Trump.
Right. So in my, it's a limited understanding, but again, I think a couple of things. I do think there is traditionally a narrative about the economy where Republicans are better for the economy than Democrats. Fight that narrative all you want, but like that's been the narrative, right? And I think, so one of the things that I think particularly white, more progressive people do is that we have sometimes assumed that people will vote their identity, right? And I think actually a lot of people vote their economy, right? Well, I shouldn't have to say that. They will vote what they think is best for their economy, even if it's not. And then I think, and I think part of the, so I'm going to just wax poetic here for a second. Part of the way that Americans talk about the economy, right, or the ways. Ways of talking about the economy that a lot of progressives like, I think, are complicated and not necessarily so go back to kind of the deep story, they're kind of boring, right? And they're hard to see. And so this isn't about Latino population, I think it's about people in general. The story that I might be the one who gets lucky, I might be the one who makes it, right? That's kind of a compelling story. It's why people buy lottery tickets. It's why people go on American Idol, right? Because someone's got to make it. And so I think there's always for people like this, there's this slow, boring work of the economy, and then there's the kind of American dream of like, yeah, but you might be the person for whom multi-level marketing works, right? So I think that there's that piece of the economy. Again, that's not just for, you know, any one racial group, I think that's true generally. The other thing that I have heard, and I want to be careful that I think it's heard, but that the gender stuff here also matters, right? That there is not, I mean, the world tends to be patriarchal, right? And so that's not just any one culture, that's most cultures. And so when people are feeling unsure, patriarchy is the language that feels comfortable. I mean, even if it's the devil you know. And so I think there's that piece of it too. That there are people for whom the projection of masculine strength really resonates. Yeah.
Could you comment on the current awareness that we have of Christian nationalism and the strength that it seems to be gaining? What threat is this to our upcoming presidential election?
I mean, I think it's a threat. How big of one I'm not. I mean, so I think there's a couple of things. I think there are a lot of people who are going to vote this way, and then it's like, who has more votes? Right? And I don't know.
Do we have some more votes?
Yeah, Christian, like people, like, yeah, I mean, at some point there's a sense of, so there's a couple things that can happen, right? There are a lot of people who believe this story, and they will vote. And in terms of who wins the election, that's a question of whose understanding of the world, you know, has more votes. So there's that one thing. There's also the threat of violence. I mean, I think January 6th showed us that, that there are people for whom, if the vote doesn't go their way, there is the option of violence. Because part of what this story says is that if the wrong people win, they're not really Americans and they didn't really win. And the real Americans get to do something about that. How big of a population that is, how much they're willing to do that, I mean, like, those are questions I think I would need to be a sociologist to answer. But I think that the story of Christian nationalism at least gives some people the sense that they can never really lose because they were supposed to be in charge, they are supposed to be in charge. So the only thing that can happen is they can be stymied. But being stymied is different than actually losing, right? And so I think that is also a threat, right? That they decide that they didn't really lose and then they get to take things back.
And those in certain Secretary of State offices around the nation, some of whom have said, no matter how it turns
Yeah.
out, we're going to make sure
Right.
our man wins.
Right. Yeah, and so I think it's
Alarming.
It's alarming, right? I think it's a question of who's really willing to do that and who, and then the other piece you never know is who's willing to say that, because right now they'll say it and then would they really do it? I mean, someone just got sentenced to 9 years in prison for doing that. I think it's a question, right? Is what you're willing to say so you're part of the in club, and then what you're really willing to do when.
Depends on who's in power.
And it does, right? I mean, I think
If you have a very conservative Supreme Court
Right.
who's willing to
Yeah.
rewrite the rules.
That's right. That's a different thing. So yeah, I mean, I think it. Okay. So anyways, there you go.